Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I'm reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and we are up to chapter 29. But before we get to chapter 29, I wanted to mention what Tim at Tim's Too Many Books pointed out was my error in the last entry that we did for chapter 28. Chapter 28 ends with a sighting of wee, sickly little Mr. Berg, who comes to the gate of Hunsford Parsonage, but does not come up the lane or into the house. And when Elizabeth Bennet, who is traveling, she is on the road. She has gone with Sir William Lucas and his daughter Maria to visit Sir William's oldest daughter, Charlotte Lucas, who was Elizabeth's best friend, and who married the odious Mr. Collins, an obsequious little worm who is also the heir to the Longbourn estate where Elizabeth and her family currently live. The Lucas's Sir William and his daughter have gone to see to see Charlotte, to see how she's doing as a married woman at Hunsford. And Elizabeth has gone along also out of she misses her friend, but she's also gone out of deep curiosity to see how Charlotte is doing, whether or not she's miserable, whether or not she can hide the fact that she's miserable. And yesterday I mentioned that Elizabeth looks at this wee, sleek little girl, this sickly little thing, and thinks, Jane Austen tells us that she thinks somewhat sarcastically, well, she'll make a fine wife for him, and does not specify him. And I said that it was Bingley that she was thinking of, but of course it's not. Tim is entirely right. It's Mr. Darcy that she's thinking of. Bingley looks like he's being railroaded towards Darcy's sister. And it's Darcy who's being railroaded towards Mr. Berg. So it's Darcy that she's thinking of. So as Tim points out, Darcy does get evoked yet again in a chapter in which he does not occur. The fault is entirely mine, and it's also long-standing. There are three little non-entities in this book that become in one way or another important to the book. And I sometimes get two of them mixed up. One of the little non-entities that becomes important in the book is Elizabeth's own sister. And I remember her because she actually motors the plot. Whereas Mr. Berg and Miss Darcy, they're more outcomes who are evoked than they are characters who are described. So I tend to get them mixed up a little. But anyway, wanted to clear up that, because we are not at Pemberley. We are not in the realm of the Darcys. So it's Mr. Berg who is it's Darcy that Elizabeth is thinking of there. And now we move on to chapter 29, which is, we've had two major things that we want to happen with Elizabeth being out and about here. Maybe three, if you include her meeting Jane in London. But there are two major things here, for not only Elizabeth, but also for us as readers. Thing number one is that Elizabeth is dying to know what price Charlotte Lucas paid for the awful bargain that she made, where she's in her late 20s, she's not beautiful, she's not accomplished, and she doesn't want to end up in servitude to some family or as a spinster hanger-on for her own family. So she has to marry, even though we're told she doesn't like men and she doesn't like matrimony, and she does. She marries Mr. Collins. That's a horrible bargain. That's a bargain that Elizabeth laughed at when it was proposed to her. She laughed at it and completely turned it down. Easily, happily turned aside any kind of pressure. So thing number one that we're interested about in this section of the book is we, like Elizabeth, are interested to know how Charlotte is getting on with that bargain, what it's like. And a large part of that will be knowing what Hunsford's like. But there's another part of this little section of the book that we very much want, and that is for us as readers, and also Elizabeth, to meet the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, this imperious force of nature that Mr. Collins can't shut up about. From his very first appearance, Mr. Collins is praising this woman, this wealthy woman who is his patroness and his next-door neighbor, praising how wonderful she is, how condescending she is, how felicitous she is, and friendly she is, and whatnot. And now, in chapter 29, we finally get to meet her. So this is the next chapter here. Mr. Collins' triumph, in consequence of this invitation, the invitation happened at the end of the last chapter when I was misidentifying a character, which is that Lady Catherine de Bourgh has invited the whole of them to a dinner at Rosings Park. Mr. Collins' triumph in consequence of this invitation was complete. The power of displaying the grandeur of his patroness to his wondering visitors, and of letting them see her civility towards himself and his wife, was exactly what he had wished for, and that an opportunity of doing it be given so soon was such an instance of Lady Catherine's condescension as he knew not how to admire enough. I want to point out here, this isn't all that surprising, because Lady Catherine is only human. She's probably very curious to know. She's probably curious to invite these people over. To some people, not to yours truly, but to some people, life in the country can get a little boring. So you'll jump at anything that's new. I confess, said he, that I should not have been at all surprised by her ladyship's asking us on Sunday to drink tea and spend the evening at Rosings. I rather expected, from my knowledge of her affability, that it would happen. But who could have foreseen such an attention as this? Who could have imagined that we would receive an invitation to dine there? An invitation, moreover, including the whole party, so immediately after your arrival. I am less surprised at what has happened, replied Sir William, from that knowledge of what the manners of the great really are, which my situation in life has allowed me to acquire. He gave a speech and got a perfunctory knighthood. He has been presented at court. He's not an expert. He's a country bumpkin. About the court, such instances of elegant breeding are not uncommon. Scarcely anything was talked of the whole day or the next morning but their visit to Rosings. Mr. Collins was carefully instructing them in what they were to expect, that the sight of such rooms, so many servants, and so splendid a dinner might not wholly overpower them. When the ladies were separating for the toilette, he said to Elizabeth, "Do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Lady Catherine is far from requiring that elegance of dress in us which becomes herself and daughter. I would advise you merely to put on whatever of your clothes is superior to the rest. There is no occasion for anything more. Lady Catherine will not think the worse of you for being simply dressed. She likes to have a distinction of rank preserved." So this could have been very friendly, very kind advice if it were delivered from somebody other than Mr. Collins. Instead, it's horrifically maladroit. It's horrifically insulting. And it doesn't reflect well on Lady Catherine if she is the way he thinks, the way he's describing her, that she likes to see people dressed differently if they're in different ranks. He's essentially telling Elizabeth, well, your rags will have to do. While they were dressing, he came 2 or 3 times to their different doors to recommend them being quick, as Lady Catherine very much objected to being kept waiting for her dinner. Such formidable accounts of her ladyship and her manner of living quite frightened Maria Lucas, who had been little used to company, and she looked forward to her introduction at Rosings with as much apprehension as her father had done his presentation at St. James's. As the weather was fine, they had a pleasant walk of about half a mile across the park. Every park has its beauty and its prospects, and Elizabeth saw much to be pleased with, though she could not be in such raptures as Mr. Collins expected the scene to inspire, and was but slightly affected by his enumeration of the windows in the front of the house, and his relation of what the glazing altogether had originally cost Sir Louis de Bourgh. So, once again, Mr. Collins knows all the financial details. How does he know these things? Are they the talk of the neighborhood? Has he talked with the glaziers? Is Lady Catherine de Bourgh enough of a chatterbox that she's mentioned the price? Did Mr. Collins know Lady Catherine's dead husband? What the price of this is doing here, I don't know. But when they ascended the steps to the hall, Maria's alarm was every moment increasing, and even Sir William did not look perfectly calm. Elizabeth's courage did not fail her. We wouldn't expect that it would. We love Lizzie. She had heard nothing of Lady Catherine that spoke of her awful from any extraordinary talents or miraculous virtue, and the mere stateliness of money and rank she thought she could witness without trepidation. From the entrance hall, of which Mr. Collins pointed out with a rapturous air the fine proportions and finished ornaments, they followed the servants through an antechamber to the room where Lady Catherine, her daughter, and Mrs. Jenkinson were sitting. Her ladyship, with great condescension, arose to receive them, and as Mrs. Collins had settled it with her husband that the office of introduction should be hers, it was performed in a proper manner, without any of those apologies and thanks which he would have thought necessary. In spite of having been at St. James's, Sir William was so completely awed by the grandeur surrounding him that he had but just courage enough to make a very low bow and take his seat without saying a word. And his daughter, frightened almost out of her senses, sat on the edge of her chair, not knowing which way to look. Do we get the impression that Lady Catherine expects this? That she wants to create this reaction? If so, she's going to get something she doesn't expect in our girl Elizabeth. Elizabeth found herself quite equal to the scene and could observe the three ladies before her composedly. Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman with strongly marked features which might once have been handsome. Her air was not conciliating, nor was her manner of receiving them such as to make her visitors forget their inferior rank. She was not rendered formidable by silence, but whatever she said was spoken with so authoritative a tone as marked her self-importance and brought Mr. Wickham immediately to Elizabeth's mind. And from the observations of the day altogether, she believed Lady Catherine to be exactly what he had represented. He has told her, Mr. Wickham has told a lot about Lady Catherine to Elizabeth. Although, is this the narrator creeping in again? I've mentioned before, this is a great work of literature. We can live in it. We can move around in it. We can move the furniture around in it. It can take it. Great works of literature can take it. Do we believe this about Lady Catherine? Well, let's see. Let's move on. When, after examining the mother, in whose countenance and deportment she soon found some resemblance of Mr. Darcy, she turned her eyes to the daughter. She could almost have joined in Maria's astonishment at her being so thin and so small. There was neither in figure nor face any likeness between the ladies. Maybe she looks like her father. Miss de Bourgh was pale and sickly. Her features, though not plain, were insignificant, and she spoke very little, except in a low voice, to Mrs. Jenkinson, in whose appearance there was nothing remarkable, and who was entirely engaged in listening to what she said, and placing a screen in the proper direction before her eyes. Wouldn't want her poor eyes to be hurt by the fireplace. Wouldn't want her poor skin to be overheated by the fireplace, but wouldn't want her to be too cool either. Cosset little hothouse flower. How completely different from our Elizabeth tromping across muddy fields to tend to her sister. After sitting a few minutes, they were all sent to one of the windows to admire the view, Mr. Collins attending them to point out its beauties, and Lady Catherine kindly informing them that it was much better worth looking at in the summer. Okay, so Lady Catherine is not saying this view that you're getting right now is the best view that anyone's ever had of anything. She's deprecating it. Just a bit, but she's deprecating it. She's saying, sure, it's a fine view, but you should see it when everything's in bloom. That's normal. That's not horrible. Well, I'm not going to do this with every time. We'll just move on. The dinner was exceedingly handsome, and there were all the servants and all the articles of plate which Mr. Collins had promised. And as he had likewise foretold, he took his seat at the bottom of the table by her ladyship's desire, and looked as if he felt like life could furnish nothing greater. He carved and ate and praised with delighted alacrity, and every dish was commended, first by him, then by Sir William, who was now enough recovered to echo whatever his son-in-law said, in a manner which Elizabeth wondered Lady Catherine could bear. So once again, Lady Elizabeth is thinking, surely the object of all this abject flattery is going to start to laugh at it. But Lady Catherine seemed gratified by their excessive admiration, and gave most gracious smiles, especially when any dish on the table proved a novelty to them. The party did not supply much conversation. Elizabeth was ready to speak whenever there was an opening, but she was seated between Charlotte and Miss de Bourgh, the former of whom was engaged in listening to Lady Catherine, and the latter said not a word to her all dinner time. Mrs. Jenkinson was chiefly employed in watching how little Miss de Bourgh ate, pressing her to try some other dish, fearing she was indisposed. Maria thought speaking out of the question, and the gentlemen did nothing but eat and admire. When the ladies returned to the drawing-room, there was little to be done but to hear Lady Catherine talk, which she did without any intermission till coffee came in, delivering her opinion on every subject in so decisive a manner as proved that she was not used to having her judgment controverted. She inquired into Charlotte's domestic concerns, familiarly and minutely, and gave her a great deal of advice as to the management of them all, told her how everything ought to be regulated in so small a family as hers, and instructed her as to the care of her cows and poultry. Elizabeth found that nothing was beneath the great lady's attention which could furnish her with the occasion of dictating to others. In the intervals of her discourse with Mrs. Collins, she addressed a variety of questions to Maria and Elizabeth, but especially to the latter, of whose connection she knew the least, and who she observed to Mrs. Collins was a very genteel, pretty kind of girl. She asked her at different times how many sisters she had, whether they were older or younger than herself, whether any of them were likely to be married, whether they were handsome, and where they had been educated, what carriage her father kept, and what had been her mother's maiden name. Elizabeth felt all the impertinence of her questions, but answered them very composedly. Lady Catherine then observed, "Your father's estate is entailed on Mr. Collins, I think. For your sake," turning to Charlotte, "I am glad of it. But otherwise I see no occasion of entailing estates from the female line. It was not thought necessary in Sir Louis de Bourgh's family. Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet?" So there we go. Another, I won't keep doing this. That's another very human moment. The Longbourn estate is entailed away from heirs female. So despite the fact that Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters are living there, they don't get to keep it. When Mr. Bennet dies, it goes to the nearest male relative. And Lady Catherine doesn't like that arrangement. But anyway, do you play and sing, Miss Bennet? A little. Oh, then sometime or other we shall be happy to hear you. Our instrument is a capital one, probably superior to... You shall try it some day. Do your sisters play and sing? Again, Lady Catherine was about to say probably superior to either the instrument you have at home or any instrument you have used, considering your station in life. She was about to say something like that, and she stopped herself. just pointing it out here, that's all. One of them does. Why do you not all learn? You all ought to have learned. The Miss Webbs all play, and their father has not so good an income as yours. Do you draw? No, not at all. What, none of you? Not one. That is very strange. But I suppose you had no opportunity. Your mother should have taken you to town every spring for the benefit of masters. My mother would have had no objection, but my father hates London. Have your governess left you? We never had any governesses. No governess? How is that possible? 5 daughters brought up at home without a governess? I never heard of such a thing. Your mother must have been quite a slave to your education. Extra funny when you know what Mrs. Bennet is like. Elizabeth could hardly help smiling, yes, as she assured her that had not been the case. Then who taught you? Who attended to you? Without a governess you must have been neglected. Compared with some families, I believe we were, but such of us as wished to learn never wanted the means. We were always encouraged to read, and had all the masters that were necessary. Those that chose to be idle certainly might. They grew up wild. She might as well be referring to wild capuchin monkeys in the jungle as far as Lady Catherine de Bourgh is concerned. Aye, no doubt. But that is what a governess will prevent. And if I had known your mother, I would have advised most strenuously to engage one. I always say that nothing is to be done in education without steady and regular instruction, and nobody but a governess can give it. It is wonderful how many families I have been the means of supplying in that way. I am always glad to get a young person well placed out. 4 nieces of Mrs. Jenkinson are most delightfully situated through my means, and it was but the other day that I had recommended another young person who was merely accidentally mentioned to me, and the family are quite delighted with her. Mr. Collins, did I tell you of Lady Metcalfe's calling yesterday to thank me? She finds Miss Pope a treasure. Lady Catherine, said she, you have given me a treasure. Are any of your younger sisters out, Miss Bennet? Meaning presented in society. Yes, ma'am, all. All? What, all 5 out at once? Very odd. And you only the second. The younger ones out before the elder are married? Your younger sisters must be very young? Yes, my younger sister is not 16. Perhaps she is full young to be much in company, but really, ma'am, I think it would be very hard upon younger sisters that they should not have their share of society and amusement, because the elder had not found the means or inclination to marry early. The last-born has as good a right to pleasure of youth as the first, and to be kept back on such a motive, I think it would not be very likely to promote sisterly affection or delicacy of mind. Upon my word, said her ladyship, you give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. Pray, what is your age? Notice, I'll get to it. We'll talk all about this at the end. This is too good to interrupt. But I do have to repeat, because this is probably the first time anyone's ever talked this way to Lady Catherine. Upon my word, said her ladyship, you give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. Pray, what is your age? With 3 younger sisters grown up, replied Elizabeth, smiling, your lady can hardly expect me to own it. Lady Catherine seemed quite astonished at not receiving a direct answer, and Elizabeth suspected herself to be the first creature who had ever dared to trifle with so much dignified impertinence. You cannot be more than 20, I am sure. Therefore you need not conceal your age. I am not 1 and 20. When the gentlemen had joined them, and tea was over, and the card tables were placed, Lady Catherine, Sir William, and Mr. and Mrs. Collins sat down at quadrille, and Miss de Bourgh chose to play at casino. The two girls had the honour of assisting Mrs. Jenkins to make up her party. Their table was superlatively stupid. Scarcely a syllable was uttered that did not relate to the game, except when Mrs. Jenkinson expressed her fears of Mr. Bourgh's being too hot or too cold, or having too much or too little light. A great deal more passed at the other table. Lady Catherine was generally speaking, stating the mistakes of the three others, or relating some anecdote of herself. Mr. Collins was employed in agreeing to everything her ladyship said, thanking her for every fish she won, and apologizing if he thought he won too many. Sir William did not say much. He was storing his memory with anecdotes and noble names. When Lady Catherine and her daughter had played as long as they chose, the tables were broken up, the carriage was offered to Mr. Collins, gratefully accepted, and immediately ordered. The party then gathered round the fire to hear Lady Catherine determine what the weather they were to have on the morrow. From these instructions they were summoned by the arrival of the coach, and with many speeches of thankfulness on Mr. Collins' side, and as many bows on Sir William's, they departed. As soon as they had driven from the door, Elizabeth was called on by her cousin to give her opinion of all that she had seen at Rosings, which, for Charlotte's sake, she made more favourable than it really was. But her commendations, though costing her some trouble, could by no means satisfy Mr. Collins, and he very soon obliged to take her ladyship's praise into his own hands. So they're riding back, and Mr. Collins asks her to sing arias of praise about everything that she's seen. Elizabeth has not been overly impressed by what she's seen. But she tries, because Charlotte is right there in the cart, and it's well known that Charlotte has to praise these people. We can't imagine that Charlotte is not all that different from Elizabeth. They were best friends for years. We can't imagine that Charlotte's impressions of Rosings Park are all that different from Elizabeth's, but she's not allowed to say them at all. And she's not allowed to keep her peace. She has to repeat these praises in the most just effulgent manner because of her husband. One of the many, many downsides of the horrible bargain that she has made. But the attempts that Elizabeth makes are not enough. Mr. Collins has to take over and start to praise everything himself in his over-the-top way. And that is our first meeting with Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And I want to point out here, the narrator of Pride and Prejudice, which for critical reasons, let's not call that Jane Austen. That blurs, I think that muddies the waters. The narrator of Pride and Prejudice doesn't like some of the characters in the book, but faithfully reports what they say. I would argue doesn't always faithfully report what they do, or at least the way in which they do it, but faithfully reports most of what they do and all of what they say. And I think that if you judge that, apart from the pronouncements made by the narrator, you sometimes get very different opinions of the people being described. You are, in this chapter, being told to dislike the Lady Catherine de Bourgh. You're being told that she's a pompous, interfering, busybody blowhard. But is it true? What does she say? First of all, she offers her hospitality. She offers her carriage to people far below her in station. She doesn't need to do that. She insists on it. And she doesn't just insist on it because there's a large party. She often makes the same insistence with Mr. Collins when he's alone, when there's, in other words, literally no one to impress. She's perfectly happy to immediately deprecate her own property by saying, well, you should see it when it's really in flower. She talks about how she loves to get young women situated in positions as governesses, keeping in mind here that if you are a Charlotte Lucas, 28 years old and plain, with no prospects, living out in the country, never going to London, well, then if you don't find a good match as a husband, you're going to end up probably as a governess. If your parents can't keep you, if they don't have the money to afford you, you're going to end up in a position like that. It's a boon. The position itself could be nightmarish, but the fact of even getting that is a boon. It means that you don't have to work in a shop or a mill or something. And Lady Catherine has helped a number of young women, and with apparently pleasing results on all sides, where the young women are happy to have a position. Mrs. Jenkinson is a live-in nurse and nanny for Miss de Bourgh. What could she possibly have to offer her nieces in the way of advancement in the world? Nothing at all. But they need to live in the world. They're young and they need to live in the world, and Lady Catherine has helped them. Okay, she talks nonstop when she's at Quadrille. She talks nonstop after and before dinner. Plenty of people do that. So we can't all be evil, can we? And I might even go farther. I won't because I think it's pressing the reading a little bit too much. But I like to think that in this scene, before things come to a head, keep in mind right now, the Lady Catherine de Bourgh has no reason to be anything other than amiable to Elizabeth Bennet. It hasn't even crossed her mind. It hasn't crossed Elizabeth's mind. It hasn't entered into the novel, except on the reader's part, that Elizabeth could ever cause any trouble for Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So she is the soul of hospitality and outgoingness. She might be imperious, but she's generous and friendly. I like to think that because that's true, that maybe that little scene might be the narrator putting her thumb on the scale just a bit. Is it possible that Lady Catherine likes the way Elizabeth talks to her? Is that possible that she does? She's not being reprimanded. She's being told, upon my word, you give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. That doesn't sound to me quite like a reprimand. I wonder. I can't push it too far in this case, but again, I wonder if maybe these two aren't liking each other just a little. If maybe, in fact, keep in mind, when Elizabeth meets Lady Catherine for the first time, it doesn't take her long to start seeing similarities between Lady Catherine and Darcy. And remember what we noticed about Darcy when he was at Netherfield Hall. He's proud and he's reserved. He speaks very little. There's also a feeling that he might be bored. He's surrounded by simpering women. His friend Bingley is entirely psychologically dominated by him. Everyone else is in awe of him, except Elizabeth. You get the distinct impression in their first encounters with each other that in addition to everything else, he's just refreshed by this. Well, I think that he and Lady Catherine de Bourgh do have a lot in common, and I'd be willing to bet that if I read between the lines in this chapter, that she rather enjoys this forthright young woman that she has already praised. That she rather enjoys the fact that she's having a little bit of wordplay, just a bit. Keep in mind, the wordplay that Elizabeth has with Darcy can be limitless because Darcy is her own age and just a guest at Netherfield Hall. But there are some lines that Elizabeth won't cross unless absolutely pushed. Some lines of decorum, and one of those is age. So when Lady Catherine says, well, how old are you? And Elizabeth spars with her just a little, she does eventually tell her. Because that would be genuinely rude. Whereas Darcy doesn't have any claim like that. Except to his toadies, and he's surrounded by toadies, and so is Lady Catherine. Imagine how different Elizabeth must seem when all the people around Lady Catherine act like Sir William does. Act like Mr. Collins does. But anyway, we have now met her. And she gave a lavish dinner, and she gave entertainment. She talked. She gave lots of advice. She was inquisitive about the stranger in her midst, and she sent everybody home in a carriage. So we have now met Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Not much that we can glean from it, except that a lot of the descriptions given to Elizabeth by Mr. Wickham about a willful and imperious person were proven true. She does seem to be that way. So what happens next? This is still just Elizabeth visiting, right? She visited Jane, then she visited Charlotte Lucas. Now she's visited the Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She's still just visiting. So we're going to continue with that, or is she going to go back home to Longbourn, or are things going to happen then? We know what's coming. The next big thing that's coming is this big vacation that she's going on with the Gardners. But what about in between then? We'll see. We'll see what we get to next time. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.